Good afternoon, everyone. My name is David Van Slyke. I'm the Dean of the Maxwell School, and we are delighted to welcome you today. Just very quickly, I want to thank Grant Rear, Director of the Campbell Public Affairs Institute, and all of the staff in the Campbell Institute, as well as Chris Ferrisy for organizing this panel presentation today. I'd also like to thank Chancellor Severud for joining us. It's a great privilege to have him here with us. And now I'd like to turn it over to Chris, who will do the introductions.
Good afternoon. Thank you, David. I'd first like to wish all of you a happy Veterans Day, and I would like especially to thank our veterans for their service and for what they contribute to the Syracuse University community. After one of the most, if not the most, contentious and negative presidential campaigns in modern American history, people went to the polls on Tuesday to vote. Most prognosticators were predicting a close Clinton victory with potential Democratic pickups in Congress. Then the votes came in and were tallied on Tuesday night. We all know what happened next. There was an historic upset where Donald Trump won a definitive victory in the Electoral College, and Hillary Clinton, as of this afternoon, is projected to win the popular vote by close to 2 million votes. On Wednesday morning, one half of the country felt vindicated and excited about an historic outsider campaign that spoke to groups of Americans who felt ignored and alienated by both political parties and see the political system as broken. The other half of the country woke bewildered by the success of a campaign that they viewed as at times being racist, xenophobic, and misogynistic. In particular, people of color, religious minorities, and the LGBTQ community are today concerned about their safety. Relatedly, I'd like to acknowledge with respect the Onondaga Nation, the indigenous people on whose ancestral lands we now stand. Our goal here today in the nation's first school of citizenship is to have a discussion so that we may better understand the election, its potential policy implications, and most importantly, each other in good faith. The format will be for each panelist to speak for about 10 minutes at the podium. Then I will probe the panelists with additional questions. And then finally, we will open it up to the audience. And for those who are not familiar with the format and the time, we run from around 4 to 5:30. Now, I would like to briefly introduce you to our distinguished panelists. First, on my right, we have Robert Erickson. He's a professor of political science at Columbia University. Professor Erickson is an expert on American political behavior, elections, and methodology. Dr. Erickson is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Next, we have Shana Gadarian, an associate professor of political science here at the Maxwell School at Syracuse University. Professor Gadarian is an expert in political psychology, public opinion, and experimental methods. Dr. Gadarian is the co-author of the award-winning book, Anxious Politics, Democratic Citizenship in a Threatening World. Also on our way here is Jamila Michener, an assistant professor in the Department of Government at Cornell University. Professor Michener is an expert in poverty, racial inequality, and U.S. public policy. Dr. Michener is the author of the forthcoming book, Medicaid in American Democracy, Federalism, Poverty, and Political Inequality. Finally, we have John Palmer, who is a university professor and dean emeritus at the Maxwell School here at Syracuse University. Professor Palmer is an expert in federal budget policy, healthcare financing, and retirement income security. Dr. Palmer recently served 2 presidentially appointed terms as a public trustee for the Medicare and Social Security programs. Please welcome our panel. Actually, we'll have you sit down there. Okay, great.
Thank you. It's great to be here, but it's sort of sad about the reasons. Is the microphone working? There you go. So it's great to be here, but it's with such a large audience, but it's sort of sad about the reasons. Let me start by offering a quotation from a great statesman from a statesman from the past, and a brief trivia question. Who said this? He said, "I think it would be a great tragedy if we had our two major political parties divide on what we would call a conservative liberal line. I think one of the attributes of our political system has been that we have avoided generally violent swings in administration from one extreme to the other. And the reason we have avoided that is that in both parties there has been room for a broad spectrum of opinion. Therefore, when your administration comes to power, they will represent the whole people rather than just one segment of the people." Sounds pretty wise. Who do you think said that? Better answer the question. That was Richard Nixon, 1959. And at that time, political scientists would probably disagree with him. They'd say, "Why don't we have a liberal party and a conservative party? Then we can get something done." That's what they were saying back then. Don't listen to the political scientists. Anyway, obviously, it's been said this is the most important election of our lifetime. And it probably is true, that the cliche is true this time. And that is, and it has been, and in particular, with an unexpected result. So that if you're opposed to Trump, not only did you not want that to happen, but you did not expect it to happen last Tuesday. And some have said this is like a black swan election, meaning that black swan being a rare event, where somehow the combination of rare things happen to create an unlikely outcome. In this case, a Trump presidency, but we said it's a black swan election even before Trump got elected. That the very fact that he was the dominant force in this election, and all the strange things that happened in this contest. And I suppose the final rare event that happened was when FBI Director Comey, 10 days before the election, announced that he was investigating new emails, which I think you can make a fair assessment that may have turned the election. Before that, Hillary may have been on a glide path to a narrow victory, but definitely on a glide path. Afterwards, the nature of the campaign changed, where Trump got energized and began to become more hinged, and Hillary had to respond as opposed to the FBI director, and attack Trump as opposed to add that positive message that she promised for the end. So, and so the consequences are great, not only in terms of Trump, but just think of Tuesday, we were talking about what's going to happen to the civil war within the Republican Party. How are they going to survive? And now we're talking about what's the deal with the Democrats now? What are they going to do? It's a major change. And so what have we learned so far? So for one thing, even before we consider Trump, being in the race, we see incredible polarization of the American electorate. Think about this, that by consensus, the most leftist member of the U.S. Senate is Bernie Sanders. The most rightward member of the Senate is probably Ted Cruz. And those were the ones who were drawing crowds and attention apart from before even Trump entered the race. And so the electorate is attracted to these polarizing figures, and not so much to those who might be think of as moderates toward the center. And excuse me, staring at my notes. And Trump managed to undo what you might call the party decides argument within political science, that the party elites get to decide who the nominee is going to be. That argument might have been seen as validated if Trump didn't run for office. Imagine Trump didn't run. He said, I'm not going to make it, not going to work. Just like others decided not to run. Bloomberg, for example, decided not to run as an independent. If he decided not to run as an independent, what would have happened? One guess would be that Jeb Bush might have beat out Ted Cruz in a battle similar to what happened on the left with Hillary. And then we had a tired, boring, not so, well, by comparison, election between Jeb Bush and Hillary Clinton. And we would have cared about the outcome, but not to the extent we care about this one. So in that sense, Trump is obviously the factor. Another thing we learned is that Trump ran against all the elites, not just Democrats, but also many of the Republicans. Or put another way, all the so-called elites, pretty much, apart from the alt-right and some folks at Fox News, were against him. So if you look at the so-called right-wing intellectuals, many of them were as articulately against Trump as those on the left, and for the same for the same kind of reasons. And we look at, for example, American newspapers and editorializing. He got no more than a handful or two of endorsements from American newspapers, which is extremely rare. That almost all supported Hillary, or else said at least not Trump. And that's so rare because, as you may know, historically, American newspapers have tilted to the Republican Party in their endorsements. This year, including many newspapers that have never endorsed a Democrat, went the other way. So this is basically a universal assessment of the elites. People at universities like this, for example, pretty universal, that not Trump. And people in the party establishment, not Trump. Many Republicans in the Senate say they could not endorse their party's candidate. In the past, that'd be a cue that there must be something wrong with your party's candidate, you better not vote for him. But that didn't work this time. Like basically, he triumphed over that. And Trump opened up what you might call a second dimension of politics. We usually think of the classic left-right split, usually over economic issues. Here's Bernie the socialist on the left, and here are the economic libertarians on the right. And that's the usual way we think of the split between left versus right. But there's a second dimension, which too crudely called democratic versus authoritarian. It usually we don't open up that dimension, but that's the one that was opened up this time. And so Trump was very skilled at acting as the authoritarian would-be strongman in the primaries, and then again in the general election. And this is similar to what has happened in other countries. In Britain, there's a nationalistic impetus for Brexit, to leave the European Union, led by the people in the UKIP party, United Kingdom Independent Party, who basically have a similar kind of program. In other countries on the continent, there are similar movements like that. I think of as somewhat authoritarian. Now, how that happened is, I would guess that in the United States and other democratic countries, there may be something like 20% of the people who would be looking for an authoritarian leader. They'd be ready for such a leader. But under normal times, we don't have that leader. In other words, that leader does not arise. And if they do, if that potential exists, like many years ago with Senator Joe McCarthy, eventually the elite establishment eventually works against such a person and their ideals. So you would think that it could not happen here. Like 2 years ago, could we say, well, what's going to happen in 2 years from now in the election? Well, we're going to have an authoritarian kind of personality, impose kind of character, appeal to voters, and actually win the election against the wishes of many in his own party, as well as a credible candidate for the opposition. How could this happen? And so I think we have to say that, among other things, that Trump is a very gifted demagogue. Obviously we have to give him his due as a politician, not just a politician, but as a demagogue who breaks the rules, breaks the barriers, says things that others won't, which somehow attracts some people. The master of the innuendo, the big lie, the kinds of things that presumably that people fear in politics. So that is the campaign. So that is a campaign. But we also know that he is a smart fellow, I presume, and so now it's a new chapter, and presumably he wants to be a good president. So what's going to happen? Is he going to be the Trump we know, who we heard is, I read about recently that first thing he wants to do is even scores. Like he has said once, if somebody screws me, I'm going to screw them 20 times over. And there's a lot of people have disagreed with him at various times, including in his own party. And so what in the world does that mean for the Trump administration? But on the other hand, he wants to, might be the old Trump, the Trump that we didn't know before the birther movement. And maybe what he wants to do is be the good president. I'm not sure he knows how to do it, but let's say that's his goal, to be a good president. So he's a blank slate. Hopefully he would have advisors that somehow would lead him in that direction. He may not be ideological at all, so we might not expect him to be the captive of the far right, even though it seems that it might be the case right now. So obviously we do not know. And so, so that's as far as I can predict the future, that we don't know. But I think the other panelists will explain the future for you.
I can definitely tell you I'm not going to explain the future because I don't even really understand the present. But I'm just going to reflect on a couple of themes I've seen through this election. And given my political science professor position, I'm also going to give some reading suggestions about things and books and articles that I think help explain different parts of this election, even if we can't explain all of it. So the first reading selection I'm going to give you is to read The American Voter. This is a classic book in American politics about the importance and enduringness of partisanship. For all the many ways that this is a black swan election, there are some themes that are very common in every election, and we see this time, and one of them is the enduringness of partisanship. 90% of Republicans supported the candidate of their party when they voted, and 91% of Democrats. Most people pay very little attention to politics and rely on the easy cue of partisanship, and this election is no exception to that, okay? Partisanship is a long-standing, durable identity that people develop through socialization and is now more central to their social identity because our parties are more polarized and our society is geographically more polarized. So that's my first reading suggestion, is to look at Converse et al. 1960. My second set of suggestions is a set of readings about social identities, okay? So here I would turn to Bartels and Aiken's recent book, Democracy for Realists, that argues that policy is not the driving force behind vote choice or the way most people go through political life. It is, in fact, social identities that matter in helping people understand their political choices. And I'm going to point out a couple of social identities that I think matter this time in addition to partisanship. The first one, I think, is one that may have been underappreciated, certainly by myself and by many other people at the beginning of this election, which is rural consciousness. And here I'll point to Catherine Kramer Walsh's new book, The Politics of Resentment. There is a class of voter who strongly identifies with being rural and who feels marginalized by elites of both parties, and for many good reasons. And this rural consciousness, I think, is part of the appeal. It's both anti-elitist and also I think Trump successfully sold arguments about the economy and the ways in which there is a lot of economic loss and economic inequality and economic anxiety in these communities that he reflected, even if we don't necessarily know that he has ways to solve some of the entrenched problems like manufacturing going overseas. The other identity I would point out is that there is, in fact, a white identity politics. We are used to thinking about identity politics being the domain of racial and religious minorities, right? The Clinton campaign had parts of their website reaching out to African American voters, to women, to Jews and Muslims. We don't necessarily think of whites as a coherent identity, but I think the work of Ashley Jardina and others suggests that one of the consequences of the presidency of Obama has been a consolidation of identities of what it means to be white. There has been a threat to the social hierarchy, increases in immigration, and a diversification of prominent offices that have created a sense of loss that have allowed for this creation of an identity that could be appealed to. Okay? So one of the ways in which we might have thought this election would go was that women would identify themselves by their gender, and that gender identity would overtake other things like partisanship or other social identities. And here, I think the lesson continues to be that gender is not necessarily a potent force in driving women towards solidarity into one party. Okay? Gender was a major theme in this election, in case you didn't notice, both what it means to be a strong leader and masculine, and what it means to be a female leader. But there wasn't maybe enough of a threat to make white women abandon their partisanship who voted for Trump, not in overwhelming numbers, but in similar numbers to past elections. Right? There was perhaps not enough of a threat or not enough of an appeal from voting for the first female president to create a sense of gender solidarity. So my third theme is looking at the emotional substrates of politics. I have, for the past 8 or 9 years, been studying the role of anxiety and fear in our politics, and I think you can certainly see the role of both economic anxiety on the right and left, and a sense of racial anxiety, and a sense of anxiety about character of Trump that played out in a variety of ways in this election. But here I would point to another set of work on the role of anger in politics, Antoine Banks' book on anger, Nicholas Valentino's work, which has the best name of all time, Election Night is All Right for Fighting, which suggests that anger is actually a motivator to get people out to vote. And here again, I think part of the turnout story or the lack of turnout story in this election is about anger. Anger is a motivator for people. It is about blame, and it is about proving your point. The other emotion in politics that is a motivator for turnout is enthusiasm. And I think this is the motivator that didn't have enough steam this time, either for Clinton or for the Democratic Party. There was not the enthusiasm, and perhaps that's the fault of the campaign, perhaps that's the fault of many other forces, but enthusiasm was not enough to get Democrats to turn out this time, because the big story about Clinton's loss is more about turnout, and the lack of enthusiasm than I would necessarily say is an endorsement of Trump. Okay. So those are kind of my 3 big themes. I think I would give some reading suggestions, and then I just have a kind of somewhat inside baseball argument is about the way we want to think about the way we study elections. Okay, part of the reason I think we underestimated the Trump vote is about the way in which pollsters figure out who they think likely voters are. And I think it underestimates new voters, that is, and in this election cycle, it underestimated the votes and the potential to turn out for Latinos. And here, the work that Matt Barreto and Gary Segura are doing at Latino Decisions, I think, points to the ways in which traditional media polls are underestimating the attitudes and turnout of Latinos, but it also will underestimate the votes of people who have not voted in a long time, who I think were motivated this time. I think it screened out many potential Trump voters, and we need to really think about, when we're looking at polls that say the public and likely voters think that, we have to be very I think, suspect of what those likely voter screens leave out and who they leave in. And the last one is, I want us to think a little bit about how we match our quantitative studies of voting preferences. That is, taking surveys of people on what they think and who they're going to vote for, and also thinking about ways that we can, in qualitative ways, like this work on rural consciousness that Kathy Kramer-Walsh has been doing long-term, in-depth interviewing and ethnography of people, and matching these kinds of methodologies to get a better sense of not only who people support, but why they support them. And I think this would be good for the parties in the coming future to also not overestimate why people support them, and actually go and talk to voters in long-term, in-depth ways that are not just about who they voted for last time. Okay, so that's what I have.
Okay, well, thank you all for being here tonight. Frankly, I'm surprised at how many of you are in the room. I personally have election fatigue, and I, for some reason, agreed to be on a bunch of things like this week. So this represents the end for me of me talking about this. I'm going to take a break and take a nap. And so I thought maybe everyone was as exhausted as I was, and why would anybody show up on a Friday night only to rehash everything that we've been through for the last 18 months. But I was wrong, and apparently you guys are gluttons for punishment. So thank you for allowing me to help to indulge that gluttony. I am going to actually shift gears and not talk about what explains the outcome of the election. I think that if there's one thing that we've shown as political scientists is that we don't know. We couldn't predict it, and I don't think we are quite equipped to explain it, although we got some reading suggestions that I think are wonderful. And we have lots to dig into and think about, and lots to learn, frankly, as political scientists. What I'm going to do is probably much less valuable but more fun for me, which is what I'm focused on right now. I want something fun in my life this week. I am going to speculate about the implications of the election of Donald Trump for various elements of public policy going forward. So this is what I do. I study public policy. And in particular, I study public policy that focuses on and emphasizes the most marginal among us, right? So I study poverty and public policy. I study racial inequality in public policy. And so I want to think about, I want to center the people who are most economically disadvantaged and think about what a Trump presidency may mean for them in terms of public policy. And so I'll focus on just a handful of policies that I admittedly cherry-picked based on my own expertise and interest. But hopefully you share some of my interest. So I'll start with, because I'm writing a book about it, or I've just finished writing a book about it, with Medicaid, right? And a lot of what I've been looking at in my book is to think about how Medicaid, in fact, has political effects, that beneficiaries of that program are learning things and getting more than just health care, but in fact, they're getting valuable lessons about their government, and it affects how they operate as political beings, as citizens, right? But one of the things I focus on in the book is federalism, and how the fact that different beneficiaries are getting different things because of the variation of that program across states and localities also has democratic implications. And now I think that I'm hoping that those insights will mean something. There are a couple of things that I think can happen with regard to Medicaid. So the Affordable Care Act, one thing that came along with it was the expansion of Medicaid. And in states that accepted this expansion, anyone who is at 138% or below of the poverty line is able to access this program now, right? So lots of people who are poor and near poor, who in many places just could not access Medicaid and now can. And that is, in fact, responsible for a large proportion of the additional people who have been insured, who have acquired health insurance in the wake of the Affordable Care Act. So now, what's going to happen with that is really up in the air, right? what Donald Trump has said is that day one, he wants Congress to put before him a repeal of the Affordable Care Act. That's trickier than it seems, and it may not turn out that way. But if it turns out that the Affordable Care Act is somehow repealed, then that means the Medicaid expansion goes away. There may be states that try to continue some version of that on their own steam, and there may be states that are, and localities that are committed to trying to continue to ensure some, at least some, probably not all, it's expensive, but at least some of the people who were covered under the Medicaid expansion. But one possibility is that it's just gone. Another possibility in addition to that one is that not just that the expansion of Medicaid is gone, but that Medicaid itself changes fundamentally, because one thing that Donald Trump has expressed interest in and that Paul Ryan is practically foaming at the mouth over is the prospect of block granting Medicaid, right? And that means that states would receive capped funding. And perhaps that funding would be per capita, perhaps it would just be a more generic amount. But that would mean what block grants tend to mean in the long term, and probably even the short term, it's retrenchment, fewer resources. And it would also mean that states would have more flexibility. And we can get an insight into what more flexibility means by looking at some of what states have proposed when they've tried to get waivers to do the Medicaid expansion the way that they would like. So states would like to attach work requirements to Ohio, for example, and Pennsylvania initially, but then a new governor was elected, so they changed tune. But attach work requirements to the program so that you need to be working or doing a certain amount of community service in order to qualify for Medicaid benefits. So there are a whole array of other things that states have proposed, some behavior-oriented requirements that would mean that you have to pay premiums if you do certain things like smoke or if you're overweight, any number of things. So it could be the wild, wild west in terms of states pretty much having a lot of flexibility and a lot of choice with what they want to do. One of the things that I show in my book is that there are some democratic implications to that. And then also there are implications in terms of us thinking about whether we want to be the kind of nation where the access that you have to something like healthcare, the nature of that access and the extent of it is almost entirely dependent on geography. And that if you cross the border between one place and the other, you suddenly have a different level of access. And so that's one possibility, one set of possibilities. So that's Medicaid. There's more. I could talk about that for a long time, but maybe everybody's not as into Medicaid as I am. There are some other things going on. We could think about anti-poverty policy more generally, what's going to happen in terms of providing benefits to those of us who are the most needy economically. It's hard to tell what direction that is going to go in because the campaign was so devoid of substance that we didn't actually get a lot of information about what Donald Trump had planned as far as many of the kind of most prominent pillars of anti-poverty policy. If, as some suggest, due to a lack of knowledge or experience, he might not be ideological, he might be a bit of a blank slate, and then maybe we have to think about those around him who may be influencing him, and about the kinds of ideas that Republicans in particular have been proposing over the last few years. Paul Ryan, who has taken on poverty as his pet issue, for better or worse, has a few things that he really likes the idea of. Attaching work requirements to food stamps, right? If you don't work, you don't eat. And we can see if that will be the kind of country that we live in, the kind of choice that is made. We know there are a few things we do know. We know that Donald Trump is committed to some degree to sort of a market ideology. And so he is also committed to tax cuts, pretty tremendous tax cuts, largely for wealthy people. And Republicans would like to balance the budget. So if you're cutting taxes at the top and you still need a balanced budget, well, the way that that works out as far as specific proposals that we've seen is retrenchment for the programs that are supposed to be helping people who are needy. So that's a kind of broad outline. And then the last area that I want to talk about is a little bit more specific, and that's in the area of criminal justice and incarceration. which is tremendously important for the kind of well-being and lived experiences of people who are living in poverty, in particular, people of color. I actually just did a lecture in my lecture course at Cornell that focuses on poverty in the US. And we spent this last week talking about poverty and incarceration. And many of us, maybe not all of us, but many of us, understand and are cognizant of the nexus between incarceration and race. We know that the jails in the United States are disproportionately filled with Black and brown people. About 60% of people in prison in the US are either Black or Latino. That is not proportional to their, the composition of our population, right? It reflects a whole number of things, and we could be here all night talking about that. But another important intersection is the intersection between poverty and incarceration. And when we look at people who are incarcerated, at least in prisons in the United States, about 52% of men were living in or near poverty prior to incarceration, and about 72% of women who are in prison in the United States were living in or near poverty prior to incarceration. So the vast majority of people who were incarcerating are people who are poor, who were living in poverty before they were incarcerated, and that's across the board. That's across racial groups. And then layered on top of that, we are in particular targeting poor people of color. And so they're suffering under the brunt of a particularly harsh and punitive criminal justice system. It looked like, perhaps, and it looks like, there is a desire to change that. And in fact, a bipartisan desire to change that. Perhaps the motivations are different, but various states have taken steps over the last few years towards decarceration and towards putting fewer people in prison. The question is, what direction are things going to go in now that we have a president-elect who very openly identifies himself as the law and order candidate, dog whistles notwithstanding, that many people hear the word law and order and think that that is in fact a racial dog whistle, but Donald J. Trump does not think that. He thinks that that is something that is appealing. And he thinks that stop and frisk is appealing. And he thinks that policies that disproportionately target low-income communities of color are the way to go, right? That's how we're going to take back America, make America safe again. The question is, in the process of making America safe again, keeping in mind that crime is at a relatively low point, if we were to compare, for example, to the 1980s or the 1990s. So in order to solve a problem that arguably does not exist and make America safe again, what will we do? A few things. One is that there's a limit to how much any president or a Congress, for that matter, can do in the realm of criminal justice, because most of what goes on in that realm is under the purview of states, right? So perhaps states will actually be, I'm usually not huge on states' rights. And in fact, I'm very critical of federalism and as an institution, especially historically and in the present, what it's done to the people who are most marginal in the US. But perhaps in this case, it will play a protective role. Federalism will play a protective role, and there will be only so much that Donald J. Trump can do. But discourse matters, and entering a political milieu where it is now acceptable to talk about criminal justice in terms of law and order, to talk about dangerous inner cities where Black people are walking around and just getting shot in the head at will all the time. That kind of imagery, that kind of discourse, commitment to those kinds of policies at the upper echelons of our political system, it likely matters. And it has an effect both on the political discourse and decisions that will happen on the state level and on what's happening more locally. And so I don't know that federalism or states having the power will be as protective of a factor as I might hope that it is. I've been this semester teaching in a maximum security prison in Romulus, New York, 5 Points, and I have a class of 16 men who are incarcerated. And we talked about this at length. The class was actually on Tuesday night, so it was before we knew the election results. They were all absolutely convinced that Donald Trump was going to be elected, each and every single one of them. And they actually span the ideological spectrum. And they were convinced that it spelled doom for them. And One of them said, you might think that it's already so terrible here in a maximum security prison that it can't get worse. He said, no, no, I've been here for 35 years. It matters who's president. It can get worse. Donald Trump will be elected, and it will get worse, right? So that's what our folks who are incarcerated seem to be thinking. That is really up in the air. I will end on this. I will end by saying, you know, we can speculate about the policy implications of a Trump presidency, but we can also plan and try to think about if there are implications that we don't like, that we're not comfortable with, that we are afraid of. What can we do? How can we, in our lives and in our communities, organize, plan, act in ways that can help to offset some of the things that might be coming down the pipeline? And in particular, when we're thinking about organizing, about planning, about trying to create change, if we're so inclined, right? This room is big enough that we are not all inclined in the same direction, I'm quite sure. But for those of us who are inclined in whatever way we are inclined and we want to take action, I would submit that we should at least be making an effort to think about, to center, to put forward the well-being of those who are already very vulnerable and very much living on the margins. And many of those folks, whether they voted for Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump, now have to live with the consequences of the decision that those who voted made, right? And so I hope that as we're contemplating our role in American politics in the near future going forward, and we're thinking about what will happen with public policy, that we're also thinking about the many, many people who can potentially suffer. Okay, I'll stop now. Thank you.
Kelly's going to put up a podium for me. One of the many disadvantages of being tall is trying to fit into spaces made for people who are generally not as big as I am. Let me say that it really warms my heart to see the full house that we have here today. It's wonderful that we get such a turnout in the immediate aftermath of the election, particularly under the conditions that were mentioned by Jamila. So particularly as an ex-dean, I'm so pleased to see so many people here on this most important subject. I too was asked to talk about the policy implications of the election. So let me begin by observing that one of the few things I can say with total confidence right now about the policy implications of Trump's election is that they're highly uncertain in almost every regard. Probably more so than with any other modern president-elect, since he doesn't have a traditional Republican or particularly coherent political philosophy or worldview, and ran a campaign with few detailed policy proposals. Furthermore, I suspect he wasn't at all serious about actually implementing some of the things he did propose during the campaign were he to become president. They were just red meat for his audience. Other proposals undoubtedly reflected a serious predisposition for acting on them, but many were presented in such a simplistic, hyperbolic, or ill-thought-out way that it's hard to anticipate just what form a concrete initiative might take once he's in office. And in any event, he'll find himself highly constrained by political realities in many areas, particularly where legislative action is necessary, despite the Republican majorities in the House and the Senate. So that said, let me briefly touch upon a few of the many important areas beyond the ones that Jamila mentioned that I knew she was going to focus on, so I tried to cast a somewhat broader, but then of necessity superficial treatment of some of these topics, where substantial change in policy might in fact be in order under a Trump administration. International affairs is certainly one. For the first time in nearly a century, we've elected a president who promised to reverse the internationalism practiced by his predecessors of both parties. He seems quite serious about this in many regards, and much of it clearly resonated strongly with a large majority of people who voted for him. Since presidents have considerable latitude in this area, a substantial shift in the conduct of foreign affairs in the direction Trump has advocated seemed likely, with the potential of fostering even more global instability than in recent years, whether for good or ill. It'll be particularly interesting, I think, to see how the tensions play out between his avowed less activist and interventionist tendencies in military and diplomatic matters and his more populist tendencies in matters of international trade, as compared with the very different tendencies of the majority of congressional Republicans in these regards and their business constituencies. Judicial policy is another area where Trump will have considerable latitude, and he seems likely to tilt it in a more traditionally conservative direction here, by virtue of whom he appoints to leadership positions in the Justice Department and as U.S. attorneys into the various federal courts. And of course, it goes without saying, and we can talk about this more if we want, the long-term implications for the Supreme Court, should he have the opportunity to appoint more than one justice, and it's quite possible that he might, will likely be profound. Other policy domains where the president has the ability to effect major change without congressional action include those where executive administrative discretion and flexible regulatory regimes play a large role. Here, Trump's most likely to use his powers to move expeditiously on matters related to immigration and climate change policies, and to generally reduce regulatory burdens on business in the interests of promoting economic growth. For example, he could quickly reverse numerous actions advanced by President Obama that have offered protections and benefits to millions of undocumented immigrants and illegal border crossers, as well as to greatly ramp up deportation and enforcement operations affecting them. And he could tighten security throughout the immigration system by various administrative means, particularly for both refugee and non-refugee immigrants from Syria and other countries of concern with respect to terrorism. Also, a general weakening of environmental regulation and opening up of federal lands, with particular emphasis on domestic energy production, seems most likely to be one of his highest priorities, consistent with his avowed opposition to President Obama's ambitious domestic and international climate change policies and the recent Paris Agreement. Of course, if he wants to more fully advance these kinds of goals in these areas of immigration, environmental and energy policy, and deregulation more broadly, he'll have to eventually engage and get permission from Congress, where the ability of the Senate Democrats to block legislation through the threat of filibuster would prove a serious constraint. Nonetheless, a substantial reversion of the current policies of the Obama administration in these areas seems inevitable. In addition to business deregulation, the other two critical policies to promote stronger economic growth on which Trump campaigned were a major reform and $5 trillion cut of individual and corporate income taxes, and a huge investment in physical infrastructure, such as highways, airports, and seaports. Here, he'll need congressional action at the outset to accomplish anything. And these two concerns almost surely will be among his earliest and highest priority legislative initiatives. Furthermore, I expect he'll find very fertile ground for them in Congress, in both principle and in practice, even though many of the details will prove quite controversial. There's been a growing bipartisan consensus in Congress on the need for tax reform over the past 2 years, and it's always easier to accomplish such reform when you're also cutting taxes dramatically in the process. Something that Senate Democrats won't be able to resist any more than Senate Republicans if pushed publicly, if this is an issue pushed publicly by the president. The devil will be in the details, including just how large and how favorable to higher income taxpayers are the tax cuts, with the Senate Democrats likely to negotiate for more moderation on both fronts in return for enough support from them to get passage. President Obama and congressional Democrats have also been calling for several $100 billion of new federal spending on infrastructure in recent years, but to no avail with the congressional Republicans. But now that Trump's proposed an even larger such initiative as part of his economic growth strategy and won the election, I expect the congressional Republicans will jump on enthusiastically and then try to shape whatever the outcome is in this area to their own liking, and will do so with considerable success. And while a large tax cut and major new investment in infrastructure should result in somewhat stronger economic growth in the near term, they will add further to already large projected future federal deficits and debt, and thus actually result in slower economic growth over the long term if financed largely through increased federal borrowing, that is, deficit, more deficits. Trump has argued that they, along with his proposed business deregulation, will result in such a large, sustained increase in economic growth that they'll more than pay for themselves in increased federal revenues over time. But this is simply an assertion, a wish, whatever, and it's not grounded in any sound economic evidence. In fact, what evidence there is suggests that these measures will come nowhere near close to actually paying for themselves, although they might somewhat offset with larger, stronger economic growth the increased borrowing that's necessary to cover the tax cuts. And if that isn't worrying enough for anyone concerned about the economic well-being of future generations who would be most impacted by this, Trump has also pledged, in a dramatic departure from orthodox Republican philosophy here, to protect seniors from any cuts in Medicare and Social Security, whose costs already account for nearly half of federal spending not devoted to paying interest on our existing debt, and are projected to rise so rapidly with the retirement of the baby boomers that their trust fund reserves will be depleted within the next 2 decades. The combination of large tax cuts with no major entitlement reform is a recipe for fiscal disaster down a road that I fear Congress may willingly go because of the immediate appeal of increased spending and reduced taxes. Finally, let me say something about the Affordable Care Act. I knew Jamil was going to raise it, but not talk about it more broadly. We all know that Trump has pushed, and Republicans on the Hill have pushed, the notion of repeal and replacement. But as Jamil alluded to, it's really a much more complex question than that. The ability to repeal it depends in part on passing the supermajority in Congress, because the threat of a filibuster means that you need 60 votes to accomplish it rather than 50. Unless you use a very arcane budget process called reconciliation, which does allow, under some conditions, a majority vote only to accomplish some changes in budget-related legislation, but there's a lot of restrictions on what it can or cannot include. And it can't be done quickly and easily at in the first 90 days of administration. It actually has to play out over the course of the first year. And so it wouldn't be consistent with the promise that we're going to do this immediately. Because of that filibuster rule, they won't be able to repeal the entire ACA in any event. Only those things that can be done through the special budgetary process. The parts that can't be repealed, even using reconciliation, include reforms to the Medicare program, a provision that requires insurers to cover young adults on their parents' policies, and requirements that health insurers sell policies to anyone regardless of their health history. These parts of the law are likely to remain no matter what happens in this area over the next period of time. The kind of partial repeal possible through the reconciliation process could lead to greater instability than total repeal. That might mean it could lead to more people losing health insurance than the estimated 20 million who've gained it under the law. Because the health law was designed with a number of independent provisions devised to keep insurance affordable. And by removing only some of them, a partial repeal could disrupt insurance arrangements, not just for people newly insured under the law, but also for those who had purchased their insurance before the law. So the repealing and replacing Affordable Care Act is good rhetoric, and it probably had a lot of appeal in the election. But without the Senate supermajority, the replacement part may be politically impossible. And making the kind of legislative changes to stabilize disrupted markets or to enact the kind of broader health reform that he's spoken about on the campaign trail will require that 60 votes in the Senate. So the new Republican government might be able to repeal much of it through a reconciliation process, but it may not be able to replace that. And one possibility is we could get repeal with a delay of a couple of years to have time to work through things, but there would be difficulty in coming up and reaching agreement on what the replacement looks like, and then we'd be in a real mess 2 years from now in terms of how it gets dealt with, both substantively and politically. Let me just briefly end by mentioning, and this is more in the jurisdiction of our political scientists here, though, that there is the ability of the Senate Republicans to change the rules so that a filibuster cannot be employed and a supermajority would not be necessary. This has been a tradition in the Senate for a long time, and there has been talk from time to time when one party gets frustrated with the obstructionism of the other party or unwillingness to allow things to move forward, of doing that. And in fact, there is some precedent a few years ago in dealing with some of the higher federal court appointees that Republicans were not allowing to get for a vote on the floor. And the Democrats considered changing the rules on filibuster, but it's not done lightly, because what you do now may come back and bite you when you're in the minority a few years later. But they did allow a temporary suspension of the law for very narrow purposes of getting through a number of these judge appointees, because the situation was getting so bad in terms of the number of vacancies and the amount of time they were waiting. And I've seen in the papers now, in the last day or two, some talk about whether the Republicans in the Senate might, and be pushed by their House fellows, might think about waiving or changing the rules on filibuster, in which case then all bets are off in terms of what could be done and how quickly it could be done, but not without profound long-term institutional consequences. And McConnell is a very strongly institutionalist member of the Senate. This is not something he would ever do lightly, but whether he can be convinced to do it some, or maybe partially or temporarily, so on, as a way of dealing with some of these issues, we'll see. But when you ask what are the policy implications going to be, an awful lot will depend on what's done or not done about these procedures in the Senate, because they'll either give the Senate Democrats lots of ability to play a role in forcing negotiation or preventing any action in a number of critical areas, or they'll render them totally impotent in this regard if a big change is made. So let me stop with that.
All right, I'm going to rejoin our panelists right now, and although each of their segments gave me about 20 questions to ask, I'm going to ask just 2 related questions before we turn it over to people in the audience today who are so nice to come out and join us this afternoon. Here at the Maxwell School, and political scientists, especially who study American politics, care about American democracy. Ben Franklin said, "It's a republic if you can keep it." What does this election tell us about the health of American democracy? And are the authoritarian impulses of Donald Trump a threat to the republic moving forward? So, light questions.
I think it depends on what Donald does. Are we going to see the Donald that we fear from the campaign? Did he just seek revenge on his enemies? Does he make poor Paul Ryan twist in the wind and seek vindication for his lack of strong support? And does he bring his alt-right people into prominent position? Does he build on the so-called law and order impulses in a strong way and build that wall and create a force which seeks out Mexicans to deport, Mexican-American? If we see the kinds of things we all feared, I think, yes, we have to worry more than if, let's say, he turns the page and says, well, that was just electoral rhetoric, and he becomes obviously an unpredictable, but just another politician trying to cope with running the office of presidency?
So I think if we see a peaceful transition of power, this tells us, and we have already seen indications from our current president and from leadership of both parties that they are willing to extend a hand and expect a peaceful transition of power. So this is one indication that our institutions are strong and there will be a republic going forward, at least for the next couple of years. I think my worry is less on the institutional side and more on the civil society side, and that what has been unleashed this election cycle is a depletion of norms of civility that I think are important in the functioning of civil society, and that the willingness to say anything, to make comments based on race and gender, have allowed people who have these impulses to feel vindicated that they have been left out of politics. And now my concern going forward is that this will lead to violence in the streets. And I think that sounds a little overwrought, except if you've seen the reports about what has been happening the last couple of days, there are reports of swastikas and people being assaulted in the name of Trump. And do I think Donald Trump caused them to do that particularly? No, I don't think he's sending forces into the street. But I do think this kind of rhetoric, this vitriol, has allowed people who have these impulses to feel empowered. And I do think this is scary for those people who are already marginalized, or for, say, speaking for myself as a religious minority, I find this troubling to feel like I was born here and I'm part of the society, but there are people who don't see me that way, and they now have a voice in politics. So so I think institutionally okay, civil society is where I'm concerned.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, I keep thinking about the last couple of days on campus and the number of students who are coming to my office hours, or to just coming to my office outside of office hours, or showing up in class literally in tears, in fear, feeling completely betrayed by their fellow Americans, feeling completely overwhelmed at the prospect of what this means for family members they have that might be immigrants, what it means for existing as a person who is a member of any number of categories of people who were on the losing end in terms of being targeted during the campaign. I don't think it's normal. So I am not that old, but I have a few elections under my belt. And I don't remember my very first election, I will probably betray my age here, was 2000. I was a freshman in college, and I remember that my Democrat friends weren't thrilled, but we were not in tears. We were not overwhelmed at the prospect of what might happen. We did not want to leave our dorm rooms. We weren't afraid about where we could travel in America now and where we shouldn't, where we should stay away, where people were going to feel empowered to say, you know, now people like you, we can treat you however we want to, because that's what our president has shown us is acceptable. So I think that this is an entirely different political milieu. It's not just about, well, the other side loses, and one side loses and the other side isn't happy, and that's the way it goes in American politics in a winner-take-all system. Sure. One side loses and the other side fears for its safety, for its well-being, for its future. That's not normal, even in a winner-take-all political system. So something different is going on. It's not clear how much of it is idiosyncratically related to Donald J. Trump and how much of it is something deeper, a deeper cancer in our civil society and our political lives. I think it's some of both. And I'm not particularly optimistic about American democracy. Do I think everything is going to crash immediately? No. But do I think that there are some things that have revealed themselves that for many of us aren't particularly surprising, but are now more salient, that do not bode well? Yes. And I wish I could say something happier. But I would be lying, and I respect you enough to be truthful.
I'm the only non-political scientist on the stage, I guess, so I don't have the thoughts that are grounded in their understanding of the political system. But what was said by both Shana and Jamil about feeling not feeling so worried about our institutions, but more worried about what happens now in civil society. Certainly seems to me it echoes with what thoughts I would have about it. You know, I think our institutions are very resilient. And if I thought that, you know, Trump was going to turn out to have Hitlerian kinds of instincts and approaches, I'd be a lot more worried. But then I think he wouldn't last very long either if that were the case. But how we respond as a civil society to all this is going to be absolutely critical. And in that regard, let me also point out that the folks who felt neglected by the elites in the rural areas and in other areas and so on, there are very real concerns there that weren't being taken seriously and weren't being paid attention to. And, you know, in some cases, change was happening too fast in their communities, or it was happening in a way that was really giving them little hope for their children and the next generations. And I think part of what needs to be addressed in our civil society and in our politics is those concerns, as well as the concerns of the people who are feeling more marginalized and threatened by this election. And we've got to figure out a way to have conversation that understands both those realities and how people are feeling and affected. And they need to begin to understand each other so that we can move forward together in a more appropriate way.
Okay. At this point, we'll go ahead and take questions from the audience. If you would like to ask a question, please go ahead and raise your hand. And we have people with microphones who can find you. Okay, if we can, right here. And then I think there's someone coming from right behind you. If you can identify yourself, please, and if you are asking to the panel or one person in particular.
Hi, I'm Scott McFarland. I work over at Upstate, live in Manlius. I was interested that none of you mentioned the bifurcation of our information worlds as a factor or a concern. And in my conversations with people who disagree with me, it's abundantly clear that they have a completely different view of some major issues than I do. And I wonder if you could comment on the effect of sort of alternate universes coexisting in our information space and our polity being split between them, so that not only are we having trouble talking about political issues, and there's a lot of vitriol in the political discussions, but there's a basic disagreement on what the facts are. And as Daniel Moynihan said, you know, he's famous for saying you can, you know, what is it, you can...
Everybody's entitled to their own opinion, but not their own facts.
Right, we're in a world where that becomes one side's opinion is the one side's facts or another side's opinion, and we don't agree on the basics of that.
They often watch the cable news networks. They don't only not agree on the facts, they don't even agree on the questions. You could watch, let's say, watch MSNBC and Fox on the same night, and you wouldn't know you're talking about the same events in the world. Each side gets preoccupied with a different set of events. I spent talking to a lot of people this week, of course, and there was a visiting professor from Mexico who I sort of casually knew, who was at Columbia. We spent about an hour talking. He just wanted to talk, and I wanted to talk. So we just talked about this. And he just said, when he sees Americans and talks to liberals and he talks to conservatives, he found conservatives somewhere in the universities, that it's like they are living in entirely different political universes. They're just totally separate, and this is just a fact. I don't know how we get over that.
So can I say one thing that depresses me in terms of thinking about this with respect to our information universes is that those are very autonomous decisions that people make that it seems difficult to control. So if at the root of the kind of causes of our social and political divisions, it's about somebody watching MSNBC and somebody else watching Fox News, or whoever you follow on Twitter versus whoever you don't follow, then that seems difficult to get a handle on. But what I think about as someone who's always trying to figure out what the relevant policy issue is that what parallels those, like, you know, social media related or just in general media related silos are actual silos in our real world, driven by things like economic and residential segregation. Low-income people live around low-income people. Wealthy people live around wealthy people. White people live around white people, usually of the same social status of it. Like, we have already, way before social media, way before the proliferation of different kinds of media in general, we laid the groundwork for many of us living quite separately from each other, such that when we do encounter one another, it's like you're from Mars. Like, I mean, I remember being at a dinner and it said, does anybody know someone who supports her? No, I don't know any, no, I don't know. I mean, yeah, we're really separate. Is that because I'm not following the right people on Twitter or I'm not watching Fox News? I mean, that is part of it, but really it's who you live around. I mean, I live in Ithaca, so everyone around me is different from me. But the point is, like, those are things that we can gain some traction on, perhaps not in the present political moment, but we can think about in the long term gaining some traction on as a way to deal with these divisions. And it's not like we have to make people follow somebody different on Twitter, but how can we arrange public policy such that we are not completely separated from anyone who's not like us?
And that'll be difficult because they're very
We haven't been able
fundamental
to
forces
achieve
at mind, right?
Yes.
And it'll take time. And I've often thought, what more immediately could be done to deal with something like this? And, you know, from the viewpoint of a public policy, you know, I think the getting rid of the draft was one of the worst decisions that was ever made in this country, because that was a wonderful, leveling, equalizing institution that brought people together. You know, your southern rednecks and your inner city blacks, you know, were serving together and beginning to see each other as individuals and understand the different viewpoints and so on. And so the one thing I would do if I were made president tomorrow is I would make my highest priority reinstitutionalizing creating some kind of national service. I'd even like to require it if I could, but I don't know if you could get away with it. And have the military be one of the options, but have lots of other options that could involve things like AmeriCorps and working in cities, you know, you can go through the list. And that, I think, in a matter of years, if a high percentage of our youth at a critical time in their lives, late teens, early 20s, had to participate in something like that, I think that would do more than any other one single thing I can think of to break down some of these barriers that we're talking about.
So I believe that, and I think that's true, but I think it doesn't have to be some national service. So we just talked about political talk in my public opinion seminar this week, and there are some institutions that we have already where we could talk more with people who are unlike ourselves, and classrooms are one of them. And I do think there's a role for teachers and principals and professors to have conversations about issues across lines of difference. And to have, so probably everyone here is more like each other than, say, like someone who is not in college, but we work with the institutions we have. But I think there are workplaces and again, other civil society places in religious organizations where we could think really seriously about how we engage with people who are unlike ourselves that wouldn't require major upheaval of neighborhoods and I think that's a good goal, but I think that's a hard goal. And I think we can work with institutions that we have, but we have to make that a priority.
Okay. Hey, if we can hear some from this side. You up here? In the back?
Hi, my name's Chris Polium. I'm an undergrad here at SU. Professor Palmer, in your remarks, you talked about a pretty stark road to fiscal instability, that being lower taxes and leaving Social Security and Medicare the way it is. I guess, could you lay out a politically feasible road to fiscal stability? Because one obvious route is to raise taxes and lower benefits, which is political suicide for either party. So I guess, is fiscal stability a reality, or in the long term are we kind of doomed?
I'm not doomed, but you are. This is a tough one. I mean, we were facing very serious lack of fiscal discipline and huge deficits over the last 10 or 15 years, some structural, some the recent recession. And we made a lot of progress against them, mainly by getting a little more control of healthcare costs. And despite everything that's happening, we did bring them down, the rate of growth down a lot. And secondly, by squeezing spending in some areas of the federal government, the so-called discretionary spending, not the big entitlement programs, in defense and non-defense alike. But we've gone about as far as we can go in those areas without starting to do really serious damage. And when you project forward under current law, given the realities of the retirement of the baby boom and the fact that those two programs are going to have to soar just to maintain currently scheduled benefits because of that, we've got a serious problem down there were we not to do anything now with respect to cutting taxes or not dealing with entitlements. And so my worry is long-term tax cuts and not taking into account the need to do some reforms in Social Security and Medicare make that outlook look worse. Do I think we ought to cut Medicare and Social Security a lot? No. But can we take some sensible policies that over a long period of time get them on a somewhat slower growth path and have the people who are affected, if anyone is affected negatively by it, be the well-off among the senior populations as opposed to the more vulnerable? Yes. And are we going to need to raise revenues more to support these programs and other purposes down the road? Yes. But now we're digging a deeper hole from which we're going to have to start. And it's so tempting for politicians. Of course, they'd love to be able to cut taxes and increase benefits. And to do the opposite, they're not going to behave differently until everyone in this room and a large part of the population of the country demands it. And that we have some enlightened leadership that educates them better about the consequences of these policies of doing what we're doing. And the combination of enlightened leadership and people demanding it will mean you'll get responses from the politicians. I'm not optimistic that anything great will happen soon with regard to our long-term fiscal situation.
And I'm just going to chime in here for a second, too, that although we don't know how the negotiations within the Republican Party are going to go in the next couple of years, if some version of Paul Ryan's path to prosperity is implemented, one thing that will happen is a shift of federal resources away from vulnerable populations to wealthier groups. And one aspect of that Trump did go into detail on for Obama's repealing and replacing Obamacare, which is even to the right of Paul Ryan and John McCain, is to have a tax deduction for health care insurance, where McCain and Ryan offered tax credits. So that's something to watch for as well.
Yeah. Now we're getting into some arcana here. The point is tax deductions mean they're worth more to you if you're a higher income taxpayer, whereas a tax credit would give the same amount to everybody. And yeah, I mean, a lot of how these things are dealt with and shaped over time are going to matter. But I was just trying to keep my eye on the larger picture of what we're going to get is a very large tax cut, regardless of its distribution, which isn't going to pay for itself through trickle-down supply-side effects, although there might be some offsets in stronger economic growth. And at the same time, we're not making any effort to do anything on the spending side in the area where all the money is. We're just more likely to put more of the squeeze in the areas that Jamila was talking about in terms of, because defense is going to go up, not down. So I can't give you a very optimistic response in the shorter run, but in the longer run, we'll probably muddle through, as we have so many times in our history. It's just we'll do it at a very suboptimal level and have a lot more collateral damage than would have been necessary.
I think we have time for one more question. We can someone in the front.
Hello, my name is Jet Cloud, and I'm an undergrad here, a freshman. And I was wondering, you said something earlier about how behavior that we've seen recently from certain groups of people is symptomatic of a certain cancer that's afflicting our society at the moment. And I was wondering if you could elaborate on what you meant by that a little bit. And then I also want to know if the rest of you were in agreement with her.
You are trying to rope me in to getting myself in trouble at the very last moment here. I have almost made it through this panel. Thanks a lot. What's your name?
Jet Cloud.
Jet Cloud. I love that name. Okay, what do I think the cancer is? I think it's a lot of things. The things that I think of most prominently probably sound extreme to some folks. But I do think that there are really deep ethno-racial anxieties in the American populace, in particular among white Americans, and actually I think across social classes. I think that demographic change, communities changing faster than folks are comfortable with, I mean, what that translates into, which is a lot of what drives the kind of part of the electorate that really strongly supported Trump. There's a really great book published recently by a political scientist named Justin Guest called The New Minority, and it's about thinking about what motivates working class and other whites. And part of what he says is, well, it's a kind of discomfort around changes that are happening in society. Sure, a lot of those changes, or some of those changes, are economic. But in a more fundamental way, what those changes mean is that people like me aren't always, and by definition, on top anymore. And I think that there are plenty of people who are deeply uncomfortable with that. And some of it is explicit and some of it is implicit. But I think that racism and white supremacy have a lot to do with what is going on in our country. But I also think that economic anxieties are very significant as well, and changes in the economy are significant as well. Economic insecurity, uncertainty over our future, whether we will be able to have access to the things that we need to live, all of those things matter. But I think some of the things that are most significantly driving divisions in our society are things that we're deeply uncomfortable with talking about, with acknowledging, and that we frankly have no idea how to deal with or get over. And the ways that would most successfully allow us to overcome those things would require dramatic change. So when we think about something like, so I mentioned residential segregation, right? And it's like, well, there's gotta be another way, right? And there were some great suggestions, and I'm totally on board with those things, but to get at the kind of deep-rooted issues that we have and have always had since before we were a nation, it means that we have to do hard things that we're not willing to do or in fact even contemplate doing for the most part. So I want to say something happy, guys. I'm just not there, and I apologize if you don't like the unhappy things that I'm saying, but anyway, that is all I will say. Any further and I will get myself in trouble.
Let me just say that this reminds me of an earlier time in American history when we were worried about civil liberties being really imperiled. It was a very different set of circumstances, not an analogy, but worried about, including at the local level, worried about what happens in the communities. And that was with the McCarthy era, which I'm sure you've all heard about, when Senator Joe McCarthy was accusing people of being communists and so on. But it wasn't just a senator making accusations about people at the national level. He encouraged others, just like Trump at his worst encourages bullying and worse at local community, so that people who particularly victims back then might have been white liberals, and who happen to be of a left, people of a left-wing persuasion, or who were suspected of being communist or harboring communist sympathies, and they suffered losing their jobs or similar kinds of problems. And the good news is it stopped. When McCarthy was stopped, then this particular form of behavior was stopped. So that we can put our institutions and our society under stress of that sort and overcome it. So
Newt Gingrich would like to bring back HUAC, though, just so we're all aware, the House Un-American Activities Committee. So just be aware that we have historical models, but there are what is past is present. And I don't disagree. I think the economic anxiety is real, but the racial anxiety is real as well. And that a lot of the concern about immigration is about differences in race and who is holding the levers of power in this country. And I think that's a hard problem, and it's not, and I don't think being quiet about it is the way to go. But in recognizing that there are people who are uncomfortable with change, and we can be empathetic toward that, while also valuing diversity and valuing that immigration does bring really good things to the economy and to the health of society, and that there are many good things that come from diversity, including all of you, who it's nice to see some very diverse faces around the room.
I don't have anything to
Right. I want to thank you all for joining us this afternoon, and I hope that you continue these conversations